lot, you'll hear me, I'm a kind of an iconoclast. I look at things oddly. And it's okay, I understand what other people are saying. Most of the time these topics are taught, they're taught cardiocentric, as though the heart is the sole cause of the circulation, right? And in our pacing study, we saw that you can drive the heart quite directly with an electrical pacer and not really improve cardiac output from it. So what I was trying to get you to start to think about is that hearts in normal systems, this is not talking about old diseased people, but in normal young people, because I'm interested in exercise, the cardiac output, the heart functions very much like what you would call a demand pump. It speeds up or increases its pumping capacity based on how much you dump into it. It's a demand pump. And so as a cure for this one-sided figure, let me fly in my modification. The cause of cardiac output is venous return. In normal systems, the cardiac output will equal whatever amount of blood you dump into it. And so for all of those thinking as I walked in, I will have several increases in cardiac output today. The walking into class, climbing the stairs to my office, going for the workout. And almost all of them are going to be, I'm not saying that these things won't change, they will mathematically, but the primordial cause will tend to be more blood is dumping into my heart. So, now let's start to analyze this figure. Notice they're saying that, mathematically, the product of heart rate times stroke volume is the cardiac output. Okay? Notice that heart rate is on here twice. One as a negative intervention, a thing that lowers heart rate. So what example did we see last time? You run the heart rate up, and the stroke volume actually drops. That was that pacing study where the patient is laying quietly on the table, and so the peripheral circulation is not altered by their nervous system or anything else. And so, if there's no change in the venous return, running up the heart rate just makes the stroke volume get smaller, and the cardiac output basically stays the same. So you can now deduce in what it says here, only if. So heart rate is a positive effect on cardiac output only if. Tell me what the only if must be. Yeah, only if you can keep the stroke volume the same. You can almost do the math. If this is going to go up and this total thing has to go up, stroke volume must remain the same or increase, and that only happens if more blood is dumping into the heart. Okay? So let's leave. You'll see that by the time we get to the regulatory part of the cardiovascular system, I want you to think of heart rate. It's so easy for us to think of heart rate as the driver because we measure it. Many of you are wearing Fitbits and such, and you could look at it. Heart rate is a follower, neurologically. Heart rate, the brain will adjust heart rate to follow and either raise or lower in conditions in which the venous return has gone up or down. So we'll see that, but just sort of leave heart rate aside. I promise your heart rate knows what to do, and you don't have to take meth or anything to get it to change. So now let's look at stroke volume. So stroke volume, we've seen that heart rate has an inhibitory effect on stroke volume, a reciprocal effect if there's no change in the peripheral dynamics. And then we have these three. So these three things influence stroke volume. We have one that if it increases, it is a positive effect on stroke volume. One that if it increases, it's a negative effect on stroke volume. And then one that the figure seems to indicate this is the big driver. And so we'll talk about each of these briefly. Contractility is pretty easy. Contractility is the inherent force with which the heart contracts. And so the easiest way to measure contractility is if all the other elements of the peripheral circulation are the same. If contractility enhances, you get a higher ejection fraction. Of the blood that arrives, more leaves. Right? So that's contractility. I can sometimes... Yeah, he's too chill. Lucky I didn't get punched. He does karate. So might up on the floor. If you get a big surge of epinephrine, you will often, if you've ever felt the heart go boom when someone scares you, that's a transient increase in contractility due to a release of catecholamines. And that we use that. You'll see tomorrow when we talk about acute instituting. Yes, sir, Moses.
So if afterload and preload aren't changing and those are volume measurements, how can you get more blood from higher contractility?
Ah, good for you. I taught you well, Grasshopper. So that's exactly right. That contractility, he's pointing out, this is a very short, like I just said, someone scares you in the graveyard if you boom. Well, that is a very, you've gone boom. And if you don't enhance venous return, it's a very short-term adjustment. It's exactly right. So you'll see that you anticipated exactly where I was heading. You'll see in tomorrow's lecture that if you're going to enhance the contractility, it behooves you, this is acutely, we'll bump up the circulating catecholamines and such. You better darn well have some blood falling into the heart if you're going to increase the amount it's squirting outward. Or you get, what is the sound of one ventricle clapping, as the Zen Buddhist koan goes. You guys probably aren't in the Zen. So that's, now in the longer term, notice that I put an A, I have A and C to point out this is what we'll do for acute exercise. The long-term change, you can tell this is made by doctors. They constantly deal with people who kill small pieces of their heart. They didn't even think to put in a column that says increased contractility because you added more myofibrils to each cell in the heart. Well, that's what I think about all day long. That's exercise. So the long-term training adaptation is to make you a bigger heart. Okay? Afterload. Notice that afterload is the only one that has a negative effect on stroke volume. Well, these two are positive, that's negative. Afterload is conceptually the hardest one. Afterload is, remember how there's two phases of contraction. There's the how much blood goes forward during isovolumetric contraction? None. Kind of futile. You're empowering the blood with pressure. At what point does the heart transition from simply squeezing a ball of blood to actually doing forward ejection? At what pressure?
When the pressure is higher inside.
When the pressure inside the ventricle goes just a couple of millimeters of mercury higher than the back pressure that's holding the aortic valve shut. So in other words, the pressure inside the ventricle exceeds the aortic diastolic pressure. So the simplest definition of afterload is what is the back pressure in the aorta at the end of cardiac filling. You can picture it, let me have you picture it. If this is the aortic valve and I am the ventricle, the aorta is up there. If the aortic diastolic pressure is low, say like many of you, the blood pressure is 110 during systole and 60 or 70 during diastole. Ready? So the heart goes. With me? Now, blood pressure is 140 systole over 110 diastole. Do you see how forward pumping has been inhibited because I'm spending more of my total energy getting the ball of blood up to the pressure that opens the aortic valve? That's afterload. Afterload, so in the simplest sense, afterload is the aortic diastolic pressure. There are other forms, clearly. If you have blockages in if your aorta has a stricture, or, there's other ways it can happen that are pathological. But the afterload, the kind of baseline afterload that all of us have to have, is we all have to have a diastolic pressure. And for the most part, the lower, the better. Okay, so let's go to the big one and we'll move on. Preload. Preload rocks. Hail preload. Preload is the stretch upon the heart, and if you were to actually use units to define it, it's usually defined as either end diastolic volume or the end diastolic pressure. That means the passive pressure before the heart starts contracting in any chamber. We usually use the atrium. And so it reflects stretch. Preload is just stretch. And you'll see, for reasons that we will understand in a moment, hearts love stretch. What hearts want is to be filled. At rest, hearts are underfilled. And so, acutely in exercise, the quickest way to increase the stretch on the heart is dump more blood into it. And Jaron, if he's not here yet, deduce that we'll talk. Over the long term, for adaptive function, one of the best ways to make the entire cardiovascular system run better is just to hold more fluid in it. Once again, this is not done by putting things in your mouth unless you're in the right state. The adaptation is created by the hormonal milieu after each workout, such that the fluids you drink after a workout, a fraction of that, winds up being incorporated as new blood. And so simply retaining an extra liter of fluid makes your entire cardiovascular system instantly better, and I'll show you that. Big figure, is that all okay? And notice how many of these things have to do with the peripheral circulation. Afterload has to do with the forward circulation, the arterial side. Preload has to do with the venous characteristics, draining into the heart. So, have you guys seen these? Did they show these in MPB 101? So I'll do them kind of quickly, but it's part of your review. This is a ventricular, left ventricular pressure volume curve. So all of these pressures and all of these volumes are inside the wall of the left ventricle. There's nothing about aortas here. You can deduce aortas. But the other thing is, does anyone see time on the axis? Yeah, so there's no time on this, which means it will drive you insane if you don't know where to start. You get oriented to time, so let's do that. At what point would the volume in the heart be the least and the pressure nearly zero, and the heart begins to expand in volume with no change in pressure? What is that? Diastole, passive filling. So always start down here or you'll become crazy. You can wind up like me. So pressure goes up and up and up. Volume goes up and up and up with very little change in pressure. So the heart is relaxing and absorbing the flow falling down from the atria. And then at the very end, I have to say, there's usually actually a little bump when the atria contracts. You get a sudden bump in pressure. If that pressure inside the ventricle goes above the atrial pressure, the atrioventricular valve will close, right? So, what describes when you have a constant volume of left ventricular blood and it just keeps going up and up in pressure, what must that be? That's isovolumetric contraction, right? It's got to be. Then notice, because someone just told me, at point B, the pressure still continues to rise, but the volume begins to empty. So something has changed. If this period is marked by a closed mitral valve and a closed aortic valve, what must have happened right there? All right? You blew open the aortic valve. So I want you to notice that this measurement gives you a sense of what the aortic diastolic pressure must be. You can actually, from B, get a diastolic pressure out in circulation because this B change occurs when the ventricular pressure is a millimeter of mercury higher than that. It's kind of cool, isn't it, Hanson? You can do that. Now, remember, it's going to keep contracting, right? And so as the blood is, it's sort of like kicking the blood out the door and stay gone. It continues to pressure, the heart continues to pull inward and pressurize the blood. So the peak pressure inside the left ventricle is actually at 120. If the aortic valve is open, what does that imply about the aortic pressure that's peak? You see we just got a blood pressure off this thing? 120 over 80 is the blood pressure here. Boom, boom. I want you to always do that when you see one of these curves. Always take the blood pressure. Okay? Then the other thing that you can get, could someone tell me how to derive the stroke volume off of this thing? End diastolic volume. So all we got to do is find them, right? The and we'll know. So if this is end diastolic volume, and that is end systolic volume, 40 subtracted from 20, I can do that. Isn't that 80? So we have an 80 milliliter stroke volume. Pretty good. It implies this is a healthy young person. Anyone want to know how to even more powerfully describe the condition of the heart? What could you do with that 80 that would really
Ejection fraction.
divide it by the initial big volume, and you'll get a value of, I don't do math, but I think it's up in the 60s. Okay. So that's a nice review of that. I have given you 3 figures. 1, 2, you're going to figure these out on your own. Notice the stippled areas reflect the native condition of the heart. And then what we're going to do is change in the figures, either afterload, preload, or contractility is going to be changed in the second new curve. And your job is going to be to try to deduce what must have changed. It's okay? Okay. So this one I won't tell you, this one I won't tell you, but the third one I will tell you to get you started. This is preload. How do I know it's preload? Well, let's look at, here's the native curve. The stroke volume appears to be 120, is this one? I can never remember, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130. 130 minus 60 would be a 70 mil stroke volume. Is that true? And then someone could divide that by 130 if they wanted to know the ejection fraction. This is in the native curve. The native curve has a blood pressure of 115 perhaps over 80. And you always got to do that stuff. You can't, you guys, cardiologists can just look at these and know what's happening, can gestalt them. You guys can't, I can't gestalt them. I got to do my math. Oh, so what happens when you dump more blood? So let's see. You simply, more blood arrives, and you go from 130, 140, 150. Notice, almost by magic, you haven't changed the peripheral circulation, you just push more blood into the heart. The aortic valve opens at the same level because that's a peripheral characteristic. Ejection happens. Strangely, you actually eject, of all the added volume, you eject it all back and you wind up at the same point. It's like magic. The heart performed better when it was filled more greatly. Is that all okay? That's preload. And that's where the Frank Starling law, I remember, in fact, in the equivalent of NPV 101 that I had, I'm going to do a great service to you by telling you, I remember seeing this, and but why? Why is it that way? Why? Right? This is showing you the more blood you dump into a ventricle, whether this is stroke volume or ejection fraction, whatever you want to use to say how good do the ventricle do will do gooder with more fluid. And they almost made it seem like a mystery. It took me years. I'm going to show you something you've already seen in this course. And we're going to apply it. You learned it in skeletal muscle. And we're going to apply it to the heart. I could have sworn we learned that the amount of force that you get out of a sarcomere is strongly proportional to its starting stance in terms of actinomycin overlap. And so that the mid-ranges in which the overlap between actin and myosin are optimized give you the best force. Okay. Do you start to see now why I deduce that hearts are understretched at rest? And if you just dump more fluid in them, the sarcomeres are postured to a better force contractile ability and you get better performance. Hearts aren't made, I'm sorry you guys, hearts aren't made to rest. Everything about the heart says that it was initially set up to do work. So they're understretched at rest. So the Frank Starling law is really just a three-dimensional, because that's volume, it's just a three-dimensional length-tension relationship, showing you that hearts get better if you throw more blood in them. Okay? Still delighted by that I finally figured out what they were trying to tell me in NPV 101. So to finish the last lecture, normal hearts will pump away what is returned to them. You can read this review on your own. Notice I haven't talked about the nervous control of the heart, and I will do that later when we get to exercise Monday, I think. But I will say one thing about regulation, and if you take Dr. Batista's NPV 113, he talks a little bit more about regulation of the heart. There's really only 2 basic cardiac reflow. There are about 20 of them, but they're only doing one of 2 things. I'm going to tell you one of them right now. Probably the more of the heart is devoted to what I'm about to tell you. So have you guys ever taking your pulse, especially those who are athletes. It helps if you're in bed. And when you inhale, your heart rate tends to speed up, and then when you exhale, it slows right down. Does everyone observe that? Good for you. Yay. So here's one of our student athletes here, Davis. She was a NC2A champion 1,500 meter runner. What happened there? What happened there? So her heart rate here oscillates between when she inhales. Electrocardiogram, the distance between the spikes means lower heart rate. When the spikes come close together, that's faster. When she inhales, her heart rate goes up to about 55, so she's bradycardic. When she exhales, her heart rate just about turns off, drops down into the 40s. Or actually in the 30s, high 30s. You with me? So what's up with that? Well, here's what's happening. We call that, if you're a physiologist and old like me, you call that the Bainbridge reflex. And the Bainbridge reflex is the same as what a cardiologist calls sinus arrhythmia. But by the way, this term arrhythmia doesn't mean sick. It's different than normal. What's happening here is when you inhale, you make a negative pressure in your thorax, in your caja de huesos, to pull air into your lung, right? Well, there's another fluid hanging about that will also move towards areas of low pressure, and that would be the blood in your vena cava. So especially when you're lying down and eliminate gravity gradients, if you take a deep breath, you're actually vacuuming blood back into the atria. With me? There are atrial stretch receptors that suddenly say, blood is arriving, especially in the right side. Blood is here. And the brainstem says, you know what the rule of the heart is? When venous return goes up, increase pumping. That's the rule. It's built into the length tension overlap. It's also in the regulatory reflexes. So when blood arrives, as the farmers say, you make hay when the sun shines. You make heart rates when the venous return shows up. Then when you exhale, that slightly positive pressure of exhalation partially collapses the vena cava. So what I'm telling you is that venous return is actually kind of 4.5, then it goes up to 5.5, then it drops back down to 4.5, and the heart rate is keeping track of that. Isn't that cool? So everything about hearts, including the neurological wiring, if I can say it that way, is set up to pump away whatever shows up out of the vena cava. Is that all right? By the way, hearts, what does this mean about, what if you had a heart and it didn't pump away, what returned to it? It's sick. Something's wrong with that. I can't tell you what a violation of the normal physiology that is. Also, think about blood is flowing into the heart, not leaving. It clearly is swelling, and this is the condition called congestive heart failure. So hearts that don't pump away what is returned to them are breaking the rules, and they have to go live in the ICU. Okay. Any questions about that? Good. So to start today's lecture, halfway through, it's okay. I can't remember. One of the lectures has not enough stuff in it. I think the last one. So ultimately, we'll catch up. Just remember where the lectures break, and the topics are organized in something that makes sense. Why is that not coming up? Oh, I see. Okay, hang on. Momentito, Carmelito. Ay, vámonos. So, on to the next topic. We've talked about hearts. Let's talk about vessels. Notice in this picture from André Vesalius, the Belgian Flemish anatomist, there's no heart here. This is his dissection of the human venous system. By the way, notice this is right after the Renaissance. This is a very old picture. So we'll go through the vessels. The vessels are the heart's easy. Dump blood in it, heart work. The vessels are much more difficult because each segment of the circulation has something different to do. And so the vasculature is very diverse in how it's structured and built. They're all tubes, but the content of the tubes and how you'll see. So where's the first artery that comes off the aorta? Does anyone know? You can't see it up here because he cut it out. The first two arteries that come off the aorta. coronary arteries that reflex back onto the heart muscle itself and supply the blood flow for the contraction that pumps. So here's a coronary artery, transilluminated through the pericardium. There is, and you see these little branches like roots go down into the muscle of the heart. Remember that the blood inside the chambers is not available to the heart muscle for energy. Can't take oxygen out of that, can't do anything with it. That's for the body. The minuscule, the reason I'm bothering you about this is still 1 American in 5 die from a single problem, which has to do with the clogging, the building of atheromatous lesions inside blood vessels in either the brain or the heart, leading to strokes or heart attacks, myocardial infarctions. Terme, this was what the massage therapist was oversimplifying. That's not, massage is completely unrelated to whether you develop these blockages or not. But they were right that it's a big problem, and those of you who take EXB-112 with me in winter, someone's going to, we will study that process a lot. So, Poissier's law. Poissier was a French physiologist back at the time of the French Enlightenment, which is right around the time of the Napoleonic Revolution, about 1800. And he was investigating, so what causes fluid to flow through tubes? And it turns out to be, when you look at Poissier's law, you freak out. But it turns out to be remarkably simple. The thing that makes the fluid move is a pressure differential. High pressure at this end and low pressure at that end causes forward flow. That which retards forward pressure movement is the resistance to flow. And while there's a lot of factors in resistance, it turns out in a cardiovascular vessel, almost none of them change except the radius of the vessel. Pi is a constant. The length of the tube is a constant. N is a constant. 8 is a constant. And so it turns out it reduces quite nicely to something easy. Forward flow is proportional to the pressure difference divided by the resistance to flow. And then in the human cardiovascular system, because the downstream pressure, the pressure back at the heart in the atrium, is essentially 0, this second pressure basically drops at 0. And so it becomes really easy. The forward flow is proportional to the driving pressure, or mean arterial pressure, divided by the resistance to flow. This simplifies out quite nicely. So if we said that mean arterial pressure is the regulated function, it's going to be the product of cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. We've already discussed what creates cardiac output, which with the big invisible thing being blood flowing into the heart creates cardiac output. Now we're talking a little bit about, so what retards forward flow? And Salvador, here's your question from last time. And I promise we'll get to blood doping in more detail when we reach that topic. But if you were to increase the blood's viscosity by adding too many red blood cells to it, you would have the perfect bad blood doping, which causes your blood to sludge and you die of heart attack or stroke. So that would be doing it wrong. This is usually an incredibly minor effect, blood viscosity. The major effect, as I've said, in this whole equation is R, the radius of the vessel, because in the resistance equation, R is inverse to flow raised to the fourth power. Resistance to flow goes up with the fourth power. So just to remember what a power function does, this implies little tiny changes in radius create ginormous, to use a technical term, changes in the resistance to forward flow. It's okay? So just to show you a lovely little illustration, this means that tubes, this should be drawn as a tube, if you change it by just 16% in terms of its radius, that's the difference here, 16%, you double the flow. I mean, that's cool. And what that allows us to do, here's a cross-section of an artery coming in and out of the board, the little smooth muscle in here, if you had to cut the diameter in half to cut the flow in half, well, these little smooth muscle cells would be overwhelmed. They couldn't do it. But fortunately, all they have to do is tense up enough to bring that in by 15%, and you cut flow in half. Or relax and allow this to move out by 15%, and you doubled flow. So how cool is that? We're going to talk a little bit about the blood next, the stuff pouring out onto the floor in this figure. Notice there's particles. So blood is really a suspension of particles. Those particles are called red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. You could even include lipoproteins as particles. And they're dissolved in a solute, a solution of water, salt, and protein. So there's the water, salt, and protein dissolved. It should be yellow in color. Sorry, I should recolor that. And then down here, by doing centrifugation, we've thrown the solid portions, which are denser, to the bottom. Got it? There's a term for this. How many animal science majors do I have? Show me my animal science. My animal sciences, this is what your professors call packed cell volume. It's very literal, the packed cell volume. We call it in medicine the hematocrit. The hematocrit, don't be lost in the jargon, it's really simple. What fraction of the total volume is occupied by cell components? So let's say someone has been either smoking or doing blood doping and has driven up their red cell components so it's half of their total blood volume. Half their total blood volume is particulates. What's their hematocrit? 50%. Cool. Same person gets shot in a bar and a large fraction of their blood volume winds up on the street. When they arrive at the emergency room, almost always the first thing you do is start an IV and just dump fluid into someone and staunch the bleeding. Well, remember, half of their red blood cells are back on Stockton Boulevard somewhere. And so as you bring them up to normal fluid volume, now only 25% of their total blood volume, what would their hematocrit be? 25%, I just gave it away. So it was supposed to be harder than that. So that is normal. Normal hematocrits are generally 42 plus or minus 3. Males tend to be a little bit higher in hematocrit, females a little bit lower. Yes?
When they bleed, doesn't the plasma come out too?
Yes, it does. Oh, realize, Tremaine, the critical part of that was, yes, in the bar, they're losing both plasma and red blood cells. When we push on the wound, bleeding stops. And what surgeons tend to, or ER doctors tend to pour into you is just fluid, salt water, normal saline. And so they're replacing the plasma element without, you can't synthesize red cells that fast. And so that dropping of hematocrit upon IV rehydration is our single biggest measure that someone is bleeding somewhere. It's much more cryptic if the person is bleeding from an ovarian cyst or a ulcer in their stomach. You don't know they're bleeding, but when you tank them up with IV fluid, you watch their hematocrit drop, and it's like, they're losing blood somewhere. Sorry, I just taught you some very basic clinical medicine. Didn't mean to. Salvador asked about blood doping, and I promise I'll talk more about it. But in blood doping, what you do is you add in more blood. Now, everyone focuses on the idea that the reason blood doping increases VO2 max is because you increase the red cells. Well, this can backfire hugely. I'll try to direct it to Salvador. You'll see that simply adding a liter of anything, I guess motor oil wouldn't work, but a liter of anything stretches the heart, stretches the peripheral tissue, the peripheral vessels, and makes you work better. So I am willing for some of blood doping's effect to be due to red blood cells. But everyone who's doing it they haven't had EXP-101 and don't realize that they could probably do the same simply by expanding their plasma volume with training. So why do I favor that method, the natural method, rather than abusing erythropoietin to drive up your red blood cells? The reason would be that here's a viscosity curve. So Salvador, the direct answer you asked about viscosity. Notice that water does not change its viscosity. When you dissolve salt and protein in the water, it does not change viscosity. The main thing that elevates viscosity is to have more dissolved particulate. Putting sand in your gas tank, bad. So notice, if this is the normal range, it looks very small, but realize this is curvilinear. If you'll see that the natural adaptation is actually lower hematocrit because you add plasma volume. Notice we have 3 viscosity units in the normal state. If, let's say the person is either a smoker or they've abused erythropoietin and has driven their hematocrit up to 55. and they're saying, oh yeah, now I'm ready for the race. They've doubled the viscosity of their blood. And the chances that the blood will plug up in a small artery or is quite, we have lost multiple young, healthy professional athletes who thought they understood how the cardiovascular system worked. By the abuse of erythropoietin, drive their hematocrit above 50, and nothing good happens. By the way, Eric, I'm not picking on you, but what about this intervention of blood doping for a thrower? Good idea or not? No, there's no oxygen transport during throwing. You can hold your breath the time it takes to go around the ring, right? It's all about phosphagens. And you can pay off your oxygen deficit while the other candidates throw. Right? So, yeah, exactly. So many of these interventions, people think they make you better. Only one intervention makes you better, training. Better meaning all facets of performance improvement. Yeah.
So if top cyclists are obviously training, why do they seem to show an improvement with doping? Like,
It works. Doping works, but my argument is that it's not just due to adding red blood cells. It has a huge amount to do with volume. And I'll show you that later. Thank you.
you're saying that you could get the same effects from training.
Exactly.
So I was just curious, it's all
Exactly. Why not add to your exercise training, add in a sauna or some other plasmic volume expanding intervention, and you'll get all the same, well, almost all the same benefits with none of the risk. So, we're going to run out of time. There's a large interval here of review. So, talking about vessels, remember that the left ventricle's job is to take blood that is poopy, that is run out of energy, and to energize it. Right? Once it's energized, that blood is asked to leave the heart and go on its journey. Notice that the pressure inside the aorta goes up by pulse pressure of something like 30 millimeters of mercury when the aortic valve is open and the next bolus of blood is being shoved in. And then while the heart rests to refill, the aorta, the vascular system is left on its own, and so the blood pressure falls slightly until the next contraction starts. So that's why we report two numbers in blood pressure, 120 over 80. It's because it's going up whenever the heart contracts, and it drops slightly when it, okay? That pressure head, and I mentioned it's important that it be something like 4 to 5 times the capillary pressure. Well, good for me, I know stuff. By having this be so high, it allows you to distribute the blood to whichever circulatory beds need it the most, right? Notice that that's the job of the small arteries, arterioles, and precapillary sphincters. They resist out the pressure and only allow flow to go where it's needed. By the time the flow hits the capillaries, the pressure's dropped to about 25 millimeters of mercury. The job of the capillaries is to leak. And then I was complaining, and where hopefully we'll get to, if not by the end of this lecture, then at the start of the next is, that scares me. How on earth am I getting the blood back into the heart if it's leaving the capillaries with a 7 millimeter pressure gradient to get home? It's very small, it scares me. It's dangerously low. I want to remind you at rest that the vast majority of your blood volume, if you have 5 liters, well, 4 of them are being held in the veins. And only 1 liter at any instantaneous moment is in the arterial side. So veins act at rest as a huge reservoir for blood. If we wanted to actually start to pump more than 5 liters a minute, we got to get some blood out of here in order to, does that make sense? Yeah, if 1 liter is in the arterial side and the recirculation time on the arterial side is, say, once every 10 seconds, 15 seconds, that means that 1 liter happens 5 times at rest. Oh, 5 liters a minute of, okay. But if you wanted to go above that, you somehow have to mobilize that venous blood. And it's not sitting still, it's trickling. It's just sort of wandering around. Last sort of, there are two more general reviews of MPB 210C. Oh crap, I am behind. That's it. The relationship of flow rate. Anyone deal with rivers? I grew up in the American River for the most part. Went to Rio Americano High School, so we went over the levee a lot. I won't say what we did. A lot of time was spent in the river. Because fluid is incompressible, right? when the channel of a river becomes closed, tight, the flow rate must go up because the same total amount of fluid is passing that as upstream and downstream. So tight river channels tend to make rapids. Right? When you come out of that canyon, that choked canyon like Bidwell Creek in Chico, and you come out to a place where it opens up into a broad, shallow, how fast does the water move there? It slows way down. Well, realize that in the cardiovascular system, if you're talking about total area, I understand that each capillary is incredibly tiny, but because they are in parallel, they're side by side by side by side, you can sort of treat their total area for flow. It's like a river delta. And so notice that the flow rate, the velocity of blood flow, when you're in the aorta, it's a pretty giddy up flow. When you get to the capillaries, it almost stops. By the way, why? And then when you get back into the venous side, it speeds up again. Why would it be a good thing to have an incredible slowing in capillaries? Diffusion. And diffusion is a time-dependent phenomenon. So if you want to exchange stuff or have osmosis of particles, solutes, slow it down. Oh, wonderful. Isn't it great? You didn't have to design this yourself. You would have screwed it up so bad. So, as I was saying, each part of the vascular system is specialized to do something specific. And I don't want you to freak out about this, but let's just, for those of you who use a software that allows you to circle things, let's just circle the big important thing. So aortas are interesting by having a huge amount of elastic tissue in them. They're like big rubber hoses. We need to figure out why. I think you'll understand that arteries, arterioles, and capillary sphincters all have the largest amount of smooth muscle. Why is that? They're the distributors. They're the ones who decide where did the blood go. I have this lovely pressure head. Who should I give it to? Then capillaries, the thing to circle on capillary is their wall thickness. Capillaries are 1 micrometer thick. They're built to leak. Capillaries are like those leaky hoses you can buy to water your lawn, and you turn it on and the water just leaks out all over the place on the hose. That's what capillaries are. Then, and it's not drawn here very well, but the venous side, they should really have a diameter. Yeah, so notice here they say the diameter of an aorta is this, the venous is this. I would have doubled these. The veins, and to hold the resting blood, the venous side is often a third larger, sometimes even twice as big as its comparable sibling on the arterial side. So veins are big floppity vessels, which is a problem, you see, because if we have a lot of low pressure fluid in a big floppity vessel, how on earth are we going to enhance the drainage out of the veins? And we'll get to that. Everyone okay? No one's head is on fire? So I think I'll do 2 of these. I was going to go through and give you examples of parts of the circulatory system. And the one that you guys seem to often have trouble with is the aorta and its Windkissel function. So why is there all that connective tissue in the aorta? Well, remember, the heart is the muscle that never rests. It's also the muscle that takes 1/2 of every second off. And so a human designer would have put in 2 hearts. Doesn't Doctor Who have 2 hearts? I think Doctor Who has 2 hearts. And almost certainly I can predict, just as a good physiologist, that when one of Doctor Who's hearts is contracting, the other is filling. And then, so it's a 2-cycle engine that creates constant forward flow. You can tell that we're an evolved system because we don't do that. We do something else that no human would ever think of. This is the aortic valve. So the ventricle is down here. And during systole, the heart is actually pumping slightly more volume in the stroke volume than can be accommodated in the aorta. And so that big elastic tube actually stretches out. And what that means is some of the energy, the pressure of the stroke volume, it gets translated from pressure energy here to stored mechanical energy in the wall. Does that make sense? When the aortic valve slams shut, so the heart can relax, this stored energy, as this blood flows downstream based on its pressure head, at some point, the stored pressure here will drop. The elastic stored energy will snap back out. And what I'm telling you is the aorta has so much connective tissue because it acts like a passive second heart. It functions during diastole to maintain flow. The German word for this, sorry, Germans found this, so you have to learn some German. Windkessel means literally a wind kettle. If you have ever seen, or pressure kettle, if you've ever seen the old-fashioned pump fire hoses where there's two firemen, they're going like this and they're pumping, but then the guy who's holding the hose, it's a continuous flow. A Windkessel is a hydraulic mechanism that converts pulses of energy into continuous flow. That's what the aorta does. That okay? Let's stop there, and next time we're very well set up to talk about the blood coming back to the heart and try to solve some of those mysteries.